Hello and welcome to another Friday afternoon at Dulwich Centre. My name is Chanel Burns and I work in Melbourne, Australia as a counsellor advocate with people from refugee backgrounds. I'm really excited today to be talking to you about practices of narrative documentation. I'm particularly going to be talking about this practice through the lens of my work with people from refugee backgrounds, exploring this practice across language and culture. I use the term people from refugee backgrounds in an intentional way as an inclusive concept that resists single-storied ideas of people and totalising people. It refers to people seeking asylum, people on permanent refugee visas, and anyone else who has had a refugee experience. This presentation offers but a small glimpse into some of my practice and learnings over the past year or so as I have been exploring the world of narrative therapy. I have three intentions for this presentation. Firstly, I will share some brief points about my principles and positioning for this work. Secondly, I will share some learnings about narrative documentation across language and culture. And finally, I will share a couple of stories of practice. My overall hope is that this presentation might inspire creativity and willingness to explore practices of narrative documentation across culture and language, to encourage you to see that these practices are possible across culture and language, though they might look different to what we read, know, or have done before. Briefly, narrative documents are those co-created between us, the practitioner, and those consulting us. They're documents that are created from the specific words, ideas, and unique insider knowledge of the people we meet with. They contribute to documenting and making visible alternative stories and to people knowing themselves differently. These documents can be used to seek witnesses to alternative stories of people's lives and to link people's lives in meaningful ways, further contributing to these alternative stories. I will not speak further on what narrative documentation is, but for those unfamiliar or interested to read more, I have included some resources on the topic that I have found useful. When I began to explore the practice of narrative documentation, I pondered a number of questions. How do we make decisions about what is and is not recorded? How do we use creativity and personal flair whilst being true to those we meet with? How do we consult those we meet with to ensure we are appropriately representing them and their stories? What kind of document do we create and what will be most resonant for those we meet with? I then started wondering about what narrative documentation would look like in work with people from refugee backgrounds. What aspects of the practice might be different? Which aspects the same? I admit that I was worried it might not be possible. Across culture and language, with the added layer of interpreters and English not being the first language of most of the people I work with, how would it work? The context of my work is with people from refugee backgrounds who are survivors of torture and trauma. Whilst this is the lens through which I share my practice, I believe that much of my learnings and thinkings apply in contexts where we might not be responding to trauma or people who've survived contexts of war, but where we are working across language and culture. I want to briefly comment on a few important principles that inform my practice broadly and contribute to the conversations I have with people and the co-creation of documents. The first idea is that no one is a passive recipient. Michael White states that no one is a passive recipient of trauma. People always take steps to try to prevent the trauma, and even if preventing the trauma is clearly impossible, they take steps to try to modify it in some small ways, or to modify its effects on their lives, or they take steps in efforts to preserve what is precious to them. I am particularly drawn to the work of Alan Wade, who talks about resistance and small acts of living. He states that in any context of violence or oppression, any act of resistance in such circumstances is inherently and profoundly significant, regardless of what it may have accomplished. The second principle is that trauma disconnects people from a sense of self, values, and what is important to them. And I will quote Michael White again, who said, "When a person has been through recurrent trauma, their sense of myself can be so diminished it can be very hard to discover what it is they give value to. This is because recurrent trauma is corrosive of what people treasure in life. It's a violation of their purpose in life and of their sentiment of living." The third principle or idea is that we need to resist the discourse of no pain, no gain. This is a discourse that suggests going right to the trauma in our work is the primary goal. And resisting this discourse can be challenging in the world of trauma work, where this discourse is often pervasive and powerful. I am particularly appreciative of Angel Ewan's critique of this discourse and her offering of an alternative concept of less pain, more gain. In resisting no pain, no gain, and embracing less pain, more gain, I work to connect with the idea that we need to create contexts of safety for people to be able to talk about trauma. The fourth principle is that all people hold unique insider knowledge. This is hard-won knowledge that should be centered and drawn on in our work with them. It is an idea that has me seeing those I work with and myself as co-researchers of problems and solutions to those problems, and that our work is a practice of co-research. The fifth principle is that lives are multi-storied, but trauma often only tells one story. In the context of the work that I do, I believe that torture and trauma stories are dominant stories that can easily shadow stories of survival and resistance and knowledgeableness. Part of our role is to seek to work with people, together with those we meet, to multi-story their lives and uncover alternative stories. Accepting that our role is to work with people to multi-story their lives and uncover alternative stories, then I believe that narrative documents are an important part of new, alternative, and preferred storylines being made visible, developed, and sustained. Practices of documentation can document skills, initiatives, responses, knowledges. They can further externalize. They can offer further questions and extend conversations, document double stories, and can be used to seek outsider witness responses. Michael White states, "Practices of the written word, which have for a long time been a theme of narrative therapy, contribute significantly to the visibility, substantiation, and endurance of the sparkling events that are identified in narrative conversations. These practices of the written word document the more sparkling events of people's lives, and in so doing contribute to rescuing the said from the saying of it, the told from the telling of it." I am now going to share with you some of my learnings about using practices of documentation across language and culture. Again, these learnings have been discovered in my engagement with people from refugee backgrounds, but I do think also apply to work where one is negotiating across language and culture. The power of narrative documents, I believe, lies in the person I am meeting with being able to hear themselves in the words. That is, they can hear their own words and ways of speaking. I have discovered that this requires not only the practice of double listening, but the practice of listening for poetic speech, certain metaphors, expressions, and ways of speaking that are unique and particular to the person I am meeting with. This practice of rescuing words requires note-taking. For me, this note-taking happens during the course of the conversation I am having with people. And it's been important for me to think about what the impact of my note-taking might be on the person I am meeting with. What is their experience of documents prior to meeting with me? Have they had negative or positive experiences? Have documents been used to ascribe negative or untrue statuses upon them? Have documents been completed without the involvement of the person, against their wishes, in a language that is not their own? Have documents been used to persecute and cause harm and distress? Have they been forced to sign documents that are unknown to them or simply untrue? With all of these questions in mind, it's very important to seek permission for note-taking and to explain the purpose of note-taking. For us to think about what messages it sends or what it says to someone also to ask their permission to take notes. To think about how we might take notes in ways that are not distressing or distracting. And finally, what it means for someone to know what notes are contributing to. I regularly work with interpreters. They are not translators who directly translate words from one language into another. The interpreters I work with are meaning-making beings who support me to understand language and culture. My experience has been that the person I am meeting with and the interpreters are commonly providing me with the scaffolding that supports our conversations, a sort of co-scaffolding. My work has me then appreciating with greater clarity the importance of seeking out experience near language that fits for the person I'm meeting with. Seeking out experience near language when there are 2 languages and 3 people in the room takes time, but it is an essential practice if we accept that narrative documents are powerful because they reflect back the words and ways of speaking of the person we're meeting with. Another consideration when co-creating narrative documents across language and culture is the ability of the person to receive, read, and understand the documents? How do we compose documents in ways that are resonant and accessible? Does the person know a little English or no English? What is their literacy in their own language? How will it be for them receiving a letter in English? Will questions be generative and thought-provoking, or scary and confronting? The asking of these questions in a reflective way each time we decide to co-create a narrative document with someone will allow us to modify our practice to suit the person we are meeting with. Another learning for me has been about how we take care of the receipt of narrative documents. How do we do this? Do we give the letter to the person in person? Do we read the letter out loud to them? What value might there be in a letter being read out loud, a sort of retelling and performance of new storylines? Do we place it in the post? Do we send it in an email? These questions will be informed by the person's language and ability to receive and read the document. And I think that the receipt of narrative documents is an important thing to negotiate at the outset of co-creating these documents. It would be foolish to send a letter in English to a person who does not read English. So in such a situation, we might need to read the letter out loud to them with an interpreter. I admit that I was quite unsure the first time I read a letter out loud through an interpreter, but my experience has been that regardless of the document not being in the person's language, they still associate value to it. Narrative documentation is underpinned by notions of collaboration and co-creation. What does collaboration and co-creation look like in work with people from refugee backgrounds? How do we account for the operations of power and authority in work with people who have been oppressed, persecuted, marginalised? How do we respond to deference and being positioned as an expert? How do we resist the position of expert but still offer knowledge to those who are in a new country and culture and often without the language of that country? These are big and important questions that encourage me to try to share with the people I meet with my preferred ways of working to see how they might fit with what that person is hoping for from meeting with me. I believe it is also important to acknowledge where we are influential and do this with care and respect. How do we decide what document is being created? What parts of the conversation are included in the document and what parts are not? What will be resonant? How much creativity can we use? How do our decisions about documents honour the words of the people we are meeting with? Are we co-creating letters, lyrics, poetry, rap, something else? How do we draw on creativity but also ensure collaborative representation? Are we documenting in ways that lead to richer descriptions of people's skills, knowledge, values, commitments, and preferred identities? What do we do when the written word is not resonant? What other creative means might we draw on to rescue the words of those we meet with? For me, a commitment to collaborative representation and co-creation means representing the words and ways of speaking of the person I'm meeting with, seeking input from the person about whether the document fits for them, and always presenting this work as a co-creation, even when the person continues to tell me that they are happy with what I'm presenting to them. All of these learnings and thinkings have led to 2 new questions alongside those 4 that I asked at the start. And they are, how am I taking account of the language and culture of those I am co-creating documents with? And what adaptations might be needed to ensure that this is resonant and appropriate? I have continued to ponder all of these questions, recognizing that there is no right answer to these, rather many possibilities depending on who we are working with, where we are working, what our role is, and many other contextual factors. These questions have, since I first posed them, become a sort of guiding force in my developing practice of narrative documentation. I'm now going to share 2 stories of practice. These stories are just a brief window into my work with 2 people, and as such do not represent the detail or complexity of these people or our work together. This first story is de-identified and I share with a pseudonym. Nuan is from Sri Lanka. He fled leaving his family behind to seek safety in Australia. Nuan was referred for counselling due to experiencing anxiety and worry. In the few times that I met to Nuan, I held on to the view that he is knowledgeable and sought to hear the ways in which he is responding to anxiety and worry. I had a picture that the problems in his life were real and distressing, but that he held significant knowledge about how to respond to them. Thus, 2 storylines were evident. I decided to write a document of Nuan's skills and knowledge of making worry less. I wrote this document drawing on mine and Nuan's conversation over 2 sessions and using his words and ideas. I was intentional in my use of the first person, third person, and collective voice, inviting Nuan to be witness to his own words and experience, alongside an acknowledgement of seeking asylum as a collective experience. I will read the document now. Nuan's skills and knowledge of making worry less. Nuan is a 28-year-old man from Sri Lanka. He is seeking asylum in Australia and is now living in the community in Melbourne after being in detention. Seeking asylum in Australia is really difficult. There is often a lot of uncertainty about the future. Often people seeking asylum will have family that are unsafe overseas. Nuan's family are still in Sri Lanka. Nuan is really uncertain about his future, and since being in Australia he is facing some troubles in his life. Nuan is finding it hard to sleep and has lost his appetite. Fear and worry are always with Nuan and have him thinking a lot. It is hard in Australia for Nuan, but he has come up with some things that help make the worry and other problems less. This is Nuan's list of things to make worry less. I know that passing 1 hour of the day is a big thing. To pass the time, I see friends, I go swimming, and I pray. I know that worry is not always there. If I have worries, I go to see my friends. I don't get the thoughts when I am with my friends. When I watch TV and movies, the thoughts are less. I share my worries. When I talk to people, the worries are less. I go to learn swimming each week. I am learning English. I read this document to Nuan through an interpreter and checked with him about whether he would make any changes, to which he responded that he would not. After reading this document to him, I asked him what stood out to him and what might be possible now from hearing this document. He said that he felt understood and that he thinks he can keep doing the things that he's been doing. Though the document was in English, I still gave him a copy, reminding myself that the act of giving these words, not hiding them away in a file away from the eyes of the person they are about, is an act of respect and resistance. I also reminded myself that these documents often have value to those we meet with beyond just the words that they rescue. This document may not be the solution to the real and serious problems of Nuan's life, but I do believe that it was the document and the retelling of it to him, and thus also the witnessing by the interpreter and myself, made it possible for Nuan to have a greater connection to his own unique knowledgeableness. This second story is shared with the permission of Ryan, who the story is about. He is happy for his story to be shared if it might help others, and anyone who might feel like responding after hearing this story can send me an email with the contact details below. Ryan is a man from Sierra Leone. He fled Sierra Leone about 15 years ago when he was a teenager. When I first met Ryan, he shared details of his past and his life now. He spoke about constantly dreaming war and experiencing highly distressing flashbacks about things that had happened in the past. These flashbacks were of atrocities that had been done to him and those he loved, and were powerfully diminishing of him and his attempts to escape them. Ryan carries many scars, not only emotional, but significant physical scars, that he spoke about as being an inescapable and ever-present reminder of the things that had happened to him. And when we first met, he talked about wanting to remove them so that he might forget. The Ryan story of trauma was definitely the dominant story. There was something that stood out to me. What stood out was his tenacity and survival in the face of great odds. Ryan was severely injured and his family taken, but he fought to survive, managing to make his way across a border and to safety. In conceiving of life as multi-storied, even when we first met, I could already see glimmers of alternative stories. It was some sessions into our work that we returned to Ryan's scars and past experiences and memories. Throughout our work, I had been writing other types of documents to Ryan, but after this particular conversation, I was considering the poetics of his words and decided to create a rescued speech poem, an idea taken from Chris Behan. The poem I composed was made up only of Ryan's words that I had rescued or taken down noted during our conversation, and I will read the poem to you now. The title of this poem is My Story to be Told. When something meant to happen will happen. You gotta push, don't give up. Look forward to the future, don't worry, man. Believe in destiny, but steps need to take. Either you are lucky or not lucky. Test of man's beliefs, test of how much you are faithful. Being in Australia, lucky. Being able to stay here, lucky. Finding and speaking to family, lucky. Having someone to talk, lucky. Stupid offences, not lucky. Being broke every day, not lucky. No people would want my life even through my complaints. When you live in the bubble of luckiness, you would know the value of it. You don't have to have a classroom to learn it. Always an average person. If luck comes to me, know someone more lucky. When action happens, not lucky. Thinking after could have been worse. My broke finger, somewhere someone lost a finger. When I was shot, I was unlucky. But I was not in prison. Did not live in the sort of fear like my mother. Learnt to understand by accepting. Come to realization in no man's land. Passing dead people, no body, no burial, somebody's loved one. Hope. That was something to hold on to. Even though hope is going to be screaming, never believe, don't listen. One door closes, look around, there is another one. Believe when losing hope that there is another hope to lift you up. We can look forward to hope when we're down. Don't want to be a negative person. So many scars show how unlucky I was. Not helpful in any ways, can't escape them. You can be looking at those scars, but know someone else is in trouble. If scars inside, maybe times I don't remember every time. Scars are visible, brain starts working rapidly, biggest fight. Scars tell path you've travelled. Scars are history. Unlucky scars and lucky scars. Scars are my story. Every single day I live with the scars. It is what it is. Be thankful for having scars to talk about. I remember when that happened. I'm alive. This poem is so clearly multi-storied. Lucky and unlucky. The scars are inescapable, yet tell Ryan's story. There is the story of trauma, of things that happened to Ryan, but there is also the story of resistance and survival, about Ryan's responses to trauma. I read this poem to Ryan at our next session, and he was teary and speechless for a moment before saying, "Wow." He said, "I can visualize me reading my story, and that's my identity." This poem created an opportunity for Ryan to be witness to the different stories of his life, and created opportunity for us to talk about the many different ways that he has survived. And this was very different to when we first met, when the dominant story was preventing us from hearing any alternative stories of survival. I wondered whether Ryan might let me hold on to a copy of the poem to share with other people who might find it helpful, and he emphatically agreed, saying that as long as it's going to help someone, you can use it. He spoke about how it's important for his stories to be told, hence the title of the poem. The co-creation of this poem created the context for us to invite people into our work as outsider witnesses, leading to the telling and retelling of alternative stories of Ryan and contributing to him and his sense of self. He also said that you can have pain and scars, but the only way to benefit is by giving and helping someone. The poem opened a space for a different relationship between Ryan and his scars, and the possibility that through his story and scars he might be able to contribute to the lives of others. Early in this exploration, I was unsure about whether the practice of narrative documentation was possible across culture and language and working with interpreters. I am now convinced that it is, but that it sometimes looks different. I continue to reflect on the way that narrative documentation might be practiced across language and culture. What role might technology play in the co-creation of documents? What ways of co-creating documents might we develop that draw not only on the use of words, but pictures, art, music? What would it be like to record a written document with an interpreter, spoken out loud in both English and in the receiving person's language? There is, of course, much more that can be discussed about practices of narrative documentation, and so again I am warned that this is just a small window into these practices. But I do hope that this presentation has given you an insight in the practice of narrative documentation across language and culture. I hope that it has maybe piqued your interest to know more, or moved you to think about how you might be bold in your use of documents across language and culture. I'm very happy to be contacted about this presentation and have provided some further readings and references for those who wish to explore some of the ideas I presented today. And finally, to finish, a word of thanks. This work is an adventure and an exploration that we embark on together with those we work with, and it would not be possible without them. I'm indebted to the many tenacious, strong, and generous people I work with now and have worked with in the past, and I thank them for everything they've taught me. Thank you for listening today. I look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you and that this has been helpful.